early in the morning the other week at around 3 a.m. I was scrolling through Instagram, which you shouldn't be doing at 3 a.m. You should try not to do ever, to be honest. But I was on Steve Lacy's Instagram where he posted his recent album art for his upcoming album. Oh yeah, or oh yeah, oh yeah. There's a question mark at the end, so I'm not really sure how he intends it to be said. But anyway, the album art kind of showed the visual direction or the artistic direction of the project. So it's like front cover and its track list, which consisted of a list of each title, but each title did not follow a kind of a shared typography or formatting. So each title with its own independent font, and then the overall track list ended up being a long vertical bar, I guess, of these strips of different like font title of each track. And why is this significant? Well, because it ended up becoming one of those rabbit hole kind of moments of creative discovery for me, where one kind of encounter with one artist or one medium inevitably ends up leading to an entire web of references or things that move me. And so I thought it was worth talking about here. When I was looking at the visual direction, specifically that track list, I didn't really think anything of it. I was actually more thinking about the project itself, rather than studying the visual dimension of it. I was looking at the track list more to just see who was going to be on the project. And that's what the vast majority of the comments were about as well. Like, oh, Erykah Badu's featured, SZA, oh my god, and all that stuff. So as I was kind of aimlessly, mindlessly, you could say, scrolling through the comments, I saw this comment that stuck out to me. I'm not really sure why, because there weren't a huge amount of likes. It wasn't at the top of the list or anything. It was just some account without even a profile picture, with about 3 likes or 3 hearts of the comment that said, oh, I'm so excited for this album, but I know at Little Mo, so they tagged another username, I know at Little Mo when I see it. And for some reason this really piqued my interest, because when people tend to format comments like that, they're usually identifying some kind of maybe plagiarism or some unacknowledged use of another artist's work in a body of work for another artist. And I think that the relationship between music and visual art, so photography or illustration, is kind of like a very, very sacred one, and usually a very symbiotic one, in which if both artistic entities respect the creative process and artistry on a fundamental level, then those two different mediums is one of my favorite avenues for collaboration. And where the visual meets the sonic is like a beautiful thing, or an illustrator's interpretation, or a visual team's interpretation of a sonic or thematic motif put forward by the musician is a great opportunity for collaboration. So this kind of interested me, because I wondered, who is Little Mo and what is this comment referring to? So I did go onto Little Mo's Instagram, which I'll put all of that in this video, and it took me to a Canadian artist actually. Give me 1 second. So in that comment, it led me to this Canadian artist called Graham Wiebe, I think it's pronounced, whose face, and yeah, his face wasn't really anywhere across his presence on social media. And then as I delved even deeper into his work and his artistry, it wasn't present on his website very much either, which was very cool. But what struck me was when I landed on his Instagram, at Little Mo, which I highly recommend that you go explore, I was met with an immediately arresting body of work that utilizes the, cut up horizontal sections of books, entire volumes of books, kind of like cut across vertically across their cover, to isolate particular phrases in each title, and then kind of placed back together into kind of a Frankenstein collection of all of these different titles that are collected from various thrifted self-help books. I'm going to try not to get too much into the unpacking of Graham's creative premise with this body of work, but suffice to say, it really moved me immediately. And mind you, one of my biggest resentments among many with Instagram when it comes to visual art is how a tiny, tiny, tiny screen is not the best format to engage with visual art by any means. This is a whole rant that I probably should try not to get into in this video, but there's such a tension that exists for me of loving how easily accessible Instagram makes the discovery of certain artists. I wouldn't have known necessarily about Graham's work, at least right now, if it hadn't have been randomly this kind of window of awareness was created from Instagram, and sort of the connectivity that one artist indirectly has to another. So I'm grateful for it in that sense, but in the kind of more so engaging with visual art sense, I wish that I had seen his work in person for the first time. I wish I had a story that included me being in a gallery seeing the original pieces themselves. But I do think that it's a testament to how cool this body of work was, that just seeing it firstly on his Instagram and then following it on to go and read more about it on his website and view the pictures of it there, it was enough to really, really move me or stir something in me. But yeah, I could immediately see that so much of the impact of that series is in its kind of physical and tactile components and how it was constructed. But even more so, on top of it being really visually striking and the choices being very immediately arresting, I think the further that I went into the writings about this body of work, the layers and very research driven and methodical and really, really thorough research and exploration into this kind of piece of work, its premise really struck me because it wasn't simply relying on how visually striking and cool the most front-facing element of that concept is, which it could have relied on that by itself and still been moving. But I think when I read the pieces available on his website that sort of supplement this series, I was struck by how in-depth and thoughtful and well-researched the ideas that are kind of being translated in these chopped up books were. And that kind of opened up an entire world of thought for me. That kind of is almost like two streams. One was the stream of thought that relates to the pieces and the meaning put forth by Graham himself, but the other was kind of more, I had this kind of meta sort of out of body moment where I was also engaging with sorry, I added my mic a bit late, so hopefully I had this entirely other kind of impact occur that was to do with just the way that I became aware of this work, and then the sort of I guess the vantage point that I observed, that the vantage point that I feel like Graham may have been approaching this work from itself. What I mean is, I think that, funnily enough, there was already sort of a natural parallel created from the purpose and format of art made by both Steve Lacy and Graham. And although that they're not, those two artists, I think, aren't, in an ideal world, maybe there wouldn't be such a clear point of connection between the two, because, my awareness of Graham came from the comment pointing out that, Steve's decision, his kind of, or the art direction that track list references is kind of appears to be quite derivative of Graham's work, which is itself quite interesting. The sort of tensions and the uncomfortable sort of awareness that comes from, different artists' use of other artists' work, specifically without credit. So that's like a whole other dimension of it, which I'll kind of explore a bit later. But also, just for me personally, the sort of unintentional parallel that was created from Steve's way of engaging with his own creative output, as far as I am aware as a listener, and then also how Graham explores a particular meaning or a particular premise in his works, but sort of the different vantage points that those two artists occupy. So Steve I'm a long time fan. Graham I only just discovered last week, so there's already kind of a contrast there in how long my awareness of these artists has existed, almost opposite really. But then also, for some reason, I spent the next few hours exploring Graham's work, everything that was available on his website. So obviously the one that arrested me the most, the initial catalyst, was his series with his self-help books. But then it led me down this rabbit hole of reading all of the pieces, and the collaborative pieces that he'd made, exploring different themes, different premises. And what struck me was that, the depth of meaning and the research and personal history that kind of exists in the very subjects that Graham is compelled to explore. I think something struck me about that as fundamentally opposite the way I think I previously engaged with Steve as an artist, which is more so this kind of lived, more personal connection to somebody who is, yes, presenting a premise to an audience, or presenting an internal environment to an audience via his music, but the kind of way that I think I engage with a lot of musicians or young musicians is that I'm sort of hearing their often emotional reality in their own words, and presented to me as a listener with some degree of an intention to be seen or understood by way of their music. So the music is kind of like a medium or a journey that, yes, plays its own independent role in my life as the listener, and I have my own independent relationship to, but you could argue that the subject that the music explores is kind of the artists themselves, their interiority, or, you know, their understanding of themselves, you know, whatever it is they were compelled to write about or explore, and their perspective. But what I found that I loved so much about Graham's work is that obviously he is the artist, and so therefore everything being explored is mitigated through his perspective, and then also his practice and his application. But I think when I read how thorough and how well researched the basis of the ideas that his work is exploring are, and how they kind of point to a depth of philosophy, ideology, research that already exists, his work almost felt like it functionally serves a different purpose than I think I'd allowed myself to, I guess, name or consciously name before that moment of seeing his work, which is that this idea that Graham is exploring, these larger ideas about, you know, spirituality, or at least how spirituality is kind of, you know, marketed or distributed in, you know, in a more commercial context, and then how he kind of arrives at meaning via sort of corrupting the original like books, and then by placing them together in this like Frankensteinian recreation, he's able to kind of put forth these new kind of questions, or these new kind of you know, or yeah, a completely new exploration of these concepts than the original material that he's referencing from, even arguably critiquing. So not only is that really cool, but I think like the world of research that's compelled him to explore this idea in the way that he has is so rich that I think it felt as though his exploration of the ideas he's exploring are only one stop in the kind of viewer's journey into the ideas that Graham is exploring. It's kind of like, it was almost like he's kind of made himself a part of the excavation. He's kind of made his art part, one dimension of an excavation process, which the viewer can sort of follow as deeply as they want to, but that ultimately leads to the idea, or to the sort of bigger questions and the bigger ideas that the work is exploring. it felt like he was becoming, his perspective was serving a wider awareness or a wider question or exploration than simply himself or just himself as the like artistic entity. And so it felt like whether you were compelled to view his work for him, to kind of engage with Graham as an artist, or whether you came into his work via the output or the idea itself that his work explores, it felt like they ultimately all lead back to this like greater depth of meaning or exploration than just him as an entity. And not only did I find a certain contrast in those two ways of being an artist, but I don't think until that point I'd ever been consciously aware of being kind of impressed by the latter. And it made me think about a lot of things. Like maybe some of that is because maybe that's like a function of like youth, or I don't know much about Graham as a person, but I do know that especially like with the social media landscape and young artists, young musicians particularly, very, very active and very fluent in the language of social media, I do think it perhaps attracts a genre of artists that ultimately wants to share their perspective and their, output with the world, but that maybe a larger portion of motivation comes from them wanting to be understood via their work. And so they are what their output leads back into. Versus, I think I really admired the way that Graham's work almost immediately, whether you research it or not, it kind of immediately points to a much bigger question than just him alone. And I think I found that very inspiring, but I also was strangely aware that I don't necessarily think they're comparable, or I don't necessarily think that I can aspire to have that kind of impact that I thought that I kind of identified in Graham's work, because I don't know if that's really a purposeful thing. I think maybe it could emerge from either not needing to have your own artistic identity like overtly present in your work, in terms of the music is often exploring overtly, Steve and his emotional reality and his sonic, imagination and whatever. But Graham's is visual, and you can engage with the work and be moved by the work and be kind of invited into its meaning completely without his overt and visible participation in that. And I think that is really cool, and it's certainly not like the only form that this exists in, but it was the first time that it struck me as quite I don't know, I found it like kind of admirable in a sense. And I almost feel like maybe there was something mature about it. I don't know. Not in a kind of like, age-centric kind of way, but just like, what would one's output look like, or what would one be compelled to say or explore or point people toward if they themselves and they weren't motivated by a need to express themselves, or a need for them their personhood, their experience, their emotional reality to be translated in their output, where would their gaze direct itself if it I guess didn't, if it wasn't inward, you know? What would they be looking at? And therefore, what would they be directing their viewer's gaze toward if it wasn't themselves as like the genesis of their art's meaning? And I guess like thematically that question has nothing to do with Graham's pieces, so it's like it was like a whole rabbit hole of like thought. But I think like it kind of felt like a strange window or a complete like non-linear kind of moment into, I guess, a question that I had never really asked myself before as an artist, because I think being young and sometimes being so like wholly, you know, encased inside the experience of being a young person, you, whether you're conscious of it or not, there is this kind of drive to like anything you do, there's also this equally potent need almost to justify your own experience or examine your own experience or convey your own experience or be understood in some way, and to translate yourself into the things that you put out there. But I kind of had this glance into expression not explicitly utilized in service of one's own, you know, like actualization in a way. I kind of saw that his work, whether intentionally or not, was like this vehicle into his reference points and these more expansive schools of thought that came before and informed his, not just his perspective, but that prompted him to want to explore his particular like subject. And I think there was something about that I found really, really compelling. And I thought about how frustrating it may be for him to have seen his work kind of just its most front-facing or visual dimension being utilized by another artist without credit. But I kind of thought, after really going on a deep dive, one, I'm grateful because oddly enough, that interaction between the two creative entities served as the window of discovery for me to discover Graham, and not just Graham, but a kind of dimension of creative practice that I'd never consciously considered before, but also that it sort of was kind of two different ways of being an artist in a sense. Like the kind of artist that Steve is tends to demand or center a kind of like visibility or legibility to culture and a bit of a larger degree of consumption in a way, because people use musicians and they use kind of musicians' output as a way of kind of arriving at their own sense of self. And so there's a dimension to that stream of artistic expression which is very like visible, highly visible, and it's the relationship it has to a subject and the listener and the subject and all that are kind of like the most kind of important. But I think that even though it was a misutilization of Graham's work, because it only utilizes the front-facing and purely aesthetic part of it, I walked away feeling like he hasn't really lost anything in terms of meaning. It's a different conversation to be had about financial compensation, which like I would hope that Graham gets. But what I mean about visibility and the fact that perhaps more people may see Steve's track list than they will the original work that influenced it, I do think that there's a quality of meaning that isn't lost at all. In fact, I think it's almost in its own category in a way, to where perhaps in a more cosmic sense, I think the right people will be led to Graham's work, whether they via all kinds of channels, but even the kind of Venn diagram of people that exist as Steve Lacy fans and Graham fans. There's probably a point at which they will, find each other, even if it's not in the most savory way. But also, I think they represent completely different artistic vantage points and completely different, almost purposes, in a sense. I think when you look at Graham's work, and particularly when you read all of the context and research behind it, it becomes impossible to reduce it to just its aesthetic components. So obviously the list of the different text is extremely striking and cool, but I don't think you can strip that away from its intended meaning without sort of losing why it's cool. When I saw it on Steve's track list, it just struck me as a purely visual choice, which I was like, huh. But when it led me to sort of engage with Graham's work, I was struck by not only like the visuals, because part of why that whole concept is cool is because it's not just a flat, Graham's work isn't just a flat, like, varying of fonts and stuff. It's actually, he cuts these really, like, he cuts into these books. He cuts across them. So there's like a sense of like depth, and there's like a tactile quality to the works that you can't really recreate on a flat surface, on a flat digitized translation of that. And so it's almost like in trying to borrow that from Graham, but only conveying its most its most 2D front-facing visual component, you've not only lost meaning, but you've also lost visual impact. And so it's almost like it's a completely different thing in a way. And I don't say that to frustrate Graham, but it's like different in the sense that sometimes if you shave away or whittle down not just the meaning, but the choices and the intentionality that informs the meaning of certain art, and you just take the most front-facing dimension of it and utilize it for your own aesthetic, your own aesthetic, it can never have the same kind of visual impact as the original. So much so that it's not what the original is. It's like an entirely different entity. And that's one. And in Steve's case, I don't like that if it was done in that kind of copy spirit. I don't really like what that says about, I regard the relationship between musician and visual artist to be a very sacred thing, and the two entities I think when they come together and they collaborate, it produces such a like new expanse of meaning that I assume that the recognition of one medium, one artist to another, is something that is sacred, but I guess not everyone engages with it that way. But you would hope. So, but that's one. But I think like, yeah, it was just, it ended up just being a strange window in which one type of influential completely opened me up to like a new genre of influential in terms of like Graham's work. So I'd really encourage you to look at it, and I'll put all of the information here. And I'm just as excited for Steve's project, and you know, perhaps there'll be a dimension now that mentions those two in the same conversation. But I think that there's like a quality of meaning and a depth of intention and research which can't be pasted. It almost evades being stolen in a way, because what you steal in the process of you like pulling it away from its original source, you've actually ended up with something different. You've actually like ripped something away from its living, I don't know, from its like living core. And so even in that act of separating the two, you now hold a completely different thing. But at least, you know, the track list as being utilized by Steve, again, points back to him as a musician and an artist, which I think is also quite telling. Like, you know, the visual components of how a musician uses illustration, photography, typography, it all serves the kind of ecosystem that is the artists themselves and the musical output, whereas Graham is both, his project is both the kind of an arrival, or it's like a kind of finished point in and of itself, but then the more you explore it, it kind of goes even deeper and deeper and deeper into this whole conceptual world. So yeah, they're kind of doing different things, but I personally was grateful for the like unlikely intersection of the two. And in terms of like honoring artists when an aspect of their output, either intentionally or unintentionally, takes from or derives from another, I think like this isn't the first time that tension has arisen in like art that I've liked. For example, one of my favorite artists that inspired actually this piece up here that I drew in year 10. One of my favorite artists is called Nicholas de Crecy, and his style, his kind of visual universe greatly inspired Sylvain Chomet, who is the director of The Triplets of Belleville and also The Illusionist. And the very, very, very first one that I encountered was actually Triplets of Belleville. That's the film I saw first, and it's credited under the direction of Sylvain Chomet, but apparently he took great influence from Nicholas de Crecy, and I think that somewhere along the way the two, you know, creative entities kind of their relationship soured quite a lot, because I think that Chomet kind of stole, or I don't know, ostensibly like took from the style and visual reference of Nicholas de Crecy, but of course Triplets of Belleville happened to kind of circulate very widely and landed in front of more audience eyes, and so people greatly credit that kind of style that we see in Triplets, which is like these really exaggerated proportions of buildings and these kind of surreal proportions, and it's very kind of line heavy interpretations of cityscapes, and hyper detailed but also quite surreal, and also the kind of like creating these really incredible cityscapes, which are kind of like these mishmash of major cities like New York, but also Paris and all these kinds of things. A lot of that people associate visually now with Chaumet, having seen Triplets, but Nicholas de Crecy was kind of at the heart of that whole visual direction. And when I found that out, I was really sad, because I'd grown up with Triplets of Belleville since I was young, and I didn't discover Nicholas until maybe late high school. But as soon as I discovered that, I kind of had this crossroads of whether to divest completely from Triplets or, sort of pretend you didn't see that or whatever and give it the benefit of the doubt. But ultimately, I kind of resolved it by deciding to just become as big a fan as possible of Nicholas's work. And it kind of gave me a sort of like inner permission to enjoy and continue to like watch Triplets of Belleville. Yes, maybe with a new awareness of how when we engage with a piece of art, we are also engaging with the references, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged. We're engaging with an entire universe of references that inform a finished product. So if anything, now when I watch it, I'm sort of aware of all of the dimensions of creative practice or expertise that's informing this film, both the ones in the credits or the stories never told. But I can still enjoy it. I can still enjoy the finished product because it serves as a reference point for me now, in its own right. And but also it prompted me to discover Nicholas, and I maybe would not have known about his work if not for Triplets, even if it was kind of an unsavory exchange. But now I'm a huge, and for the last decade, I've been like a huge Nicholas de Crecy fan. So I'm sort of able to hold both, but I think that I kind of treat them as two different entities. And, I try to buy Nicholas's work. So in some ways, it all just becomes that sort of circular exchange.